Yes. Christina Campbell, her starting point from Blanca Santiago.
Okay, great. I'm great. How are you? Hi. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Yes, when everyone is having a fabulous time, they can't stop talking. And that is a beautiful thing, but I'm going to ask the back. I'm going to ask the back. There's nothing like ordered chaos. So, Maggie, your phone. So I don't know how many of you know that, number one, I'm a scholar, right? And then number two, that my scholarship is centered on indigenous identity. And so one of the lessons that I learned over the past 25 years in the field of identity is how important it is to recognize naming conventions and protocols. There's nothing more complimentary than to be identified. And so I want to open up the reception by identifying some people who allowed us to kick off the Justice for Women lecture series, where we discussed the Latinx community in Maine and how it is enhancing our existence here in Maine. So I'd like for certain people, if you are here, to join me. Jacqueline Mahano Alvarez. Bad accent, maybe. Great. Jacqueline. Correct. Julia Trujillo. Julia. Cristina Ocampo. Blanca Santiago. And Crystal Crone. So thank you for all that you have committed to launching Justice for Women 2019. Sometimes in communities we have the blind sight of only recognizing two poles. And in America, it's easy to do that. There's black and there's white. And that's just not the extent of diversity in our country. And then layer on the intersections of immigrant, asylee, refugee. And you have a complex dialogue that happens internally for people. And imagine how complex and difficult that is when you're also trying to learn about a new community. And so I wanted to give these extraordinary women my time at the introduction of this reception to talk about the Latinx community in Maine and the complicated intersections that they face and the work that you are doing to make their transitions possible. So thank you.
So, I was not expecting this at all. So, no estoy preparada. So, I'm just not prepared. And kind of overwhelmed. So, thank you very much for this recognition. It's been 30 years of working in this community and watching so many changes And mostly, like, I've seen lots of people from all different countries, 64 different languages spoken in Portland Public Schools. And I work with all of those kids as a social worker at Portland Public Schools. But because I come, with my identity as a Latin American woman, a Puerto Rican woman, I, identify with how it feels to be a Spanish-speaking person who is trying to, like, figure things out. And I can't even imagine what it's like to flee a country where your very life is threatened, where you don't know whether your children are going to be okay. You know you can't make a living, and then you come here, and you risk everything to come here, to give your children a better life. And you don't know the language, just as you said. You don't know the language, you don't know the culture. You don't have documented status. You're just trying to do the best you can. You work 2 and 3 jobs. You send your kids to public schools. They learn the language. They become sometimes different. Sometimes just, it's wonderful. And other times they really struggle. And so we're there, as I'd like to say that Portland Public Schools does a really good job, or the very best job that they can do. So the Multilingual Center invited all of these mothers to come from the Latinx community. I believe there were like 9 mothers and 1 dad. And we had breakfast and talked to Malu and to Kathy Lee and to Marsha about what it was that they were experiencing, and overwhelmingly, they really struggled. It was fear. And so we're fear. They live in fear all of the time, like going to work, going to school, going to church, not knowing whether your mom is going to be there when you get back. And I was especially touched by the panel presentation because it talked about all of the service providers and the way that they are just completely overwhelmed with what it is that they and to Marsha need, what they sometimes they don't have, and resources, how few people, Crystal, so fear, they live in fear because she's living, like going to family right now, going to school, going to church, not knowing she gets calls mom is going to be there when you get back, there aren't enough resources. I was especially touched by the panel presentation, and then, then when the panelists spoke, in the afternoon, we were able to hear from not just from the service providers, but also hear from hearing high school who has lived this experience of living kind of because she's living like family right say that. That's how I sort of saw the experience was like. And a young person really strong and family values, your mom and your dad have taught you, but you're up against something that most kids, including the kids who are here seeking asylum, are not facing because there's a path for them and there may not be. Or there are paths that were given and then taken away. So if that's enough for you to feel like you've got something to say, I'd like for you to say it now.
Oh, hello, my name is Jackie, and I'm a junior at Deering High School. And I can tell you about my experience as a Latina in Maine. So I grew up in Portland, so I did go to the Portland Public Schools, and they do a really good job, for me as a Latina expressing my culture. But I did go to South Portland, and like I said on the panel on Monday, that lacks culture. It lacks a lot of culture, and it was very difficult for me there, so I did struggle, and I did experience a lot of racism, discrimination, everything over there. So, and me as, I do have immigrant parents, and they do have TPS, which was terminated this year, and I think the ending date for that is September. So for me, that means my parents could be deported, and I would have to be living here on my own at age 17, providing for myself and maybe for my little brother. And so I am facing difficulties, but hopefully I'm here to raise awareness for everyone that is struggling, because I feel like our pain is not seen. So I feel like I'm going to try to work to provide help for everyone that needs it. So thank you. Okay.
So I want to thank you all for being here and allowing me to cede my time to both Blanca and to Jackie. And I want to say thank you to Maria Luisa for coming such a distance to educate us, to enlighten us, and to fill us with courage to face very challenging issues ahead. And so you're going to give a talk, but I just wanted you to come up and so that everyone can see you. And so you'll hear from Maria Luisa. You're going to hear from, of course, Kathy Lee when we award the Courage is Contagious Award to Lucky Hollander. Where is she? And so this just gives you a preview of what's going to happen this evening. And so enjoy the food, enjoy the reception, and remember, we always start on time.
Hi guys, if everybody can please scoot to the center, we need to have as many seats available as we can, so please move towards the center and make sure that there's not a bunch of empty seats around you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Wow. Good evening, everyone. There we go. The first thing that I would like to say in the spirit of access is to recognize the volunteerism of Blanca Santiago, who has agreed to translate. So if you require translation, you may move your seat to Blanca's location. Blanca is, please stand up, Blanca. That gave Maggie time to roll the tape.
Actually, right after my father died, and I had been doing a lot of international work. Most of my climate work was in Southern Africa, and I just felt I needed to do something here to follow in his footsteps and come up with something that I could contribute.
The Justice for Women Lecture is a series that brings a distinguished woman leader to Maine for a week annually to present a public lecture and to contribute to a global conversation about justice for women and girls in developing countries. While in Maine, lecturers also meet with a wide range of students and community groups to spread the word about how to address and be responsive to the challenges that face women and girls.
I think something that's really unique about the Justice for Women lecture is that it brings these powerhouse leaders and people who have overcome such challenges from all over the world to the home communities of so many individuals. And I think it's really important to offer those sort of examples and experiences to our young girls and really just encourage them to raise their voices and know that they are powerful, and there's examples out there of different women who have done the same.
When we see how the young women throng the speakers after they've finished their talk to ask them questions or exchange emails, you can see how excited they are and how inspired they've been by the speaker.
Mariam Jalabi's visit to my class was amazing. The students were super excited and energized, I think, in so many different ways, because they could connect with Mariam's story. But most importantly, they could connect with the children of Syria, and especially to the struggles that they're facing.
Maine's demographic has been changing over the last 10 years. We've had an influx of immigrants, initially from Africa, but now from all over the world.
Our school is most diverse school north of Boston, and a lot of students and their families are connected to other parts of the world. So hearing from this, global issues is very important.
We all are in it together. So we're using the Justice for Women program as one of many foundations that help us in doing good things in our communities. I think it's important to support the program because it needs to be a continuous conversation.
It gives us an opportunity to have honest dialogues with ourselves, and it creates a community like no other organization.
We're just really grateful for the opportunity. I think inspiring our young women who come from very, very diverse backgrounds and seeing leaders that represent them or reflect sort of some of their identities, and not be afraid to tackle some of the world's greatest problems because they have examples demonstrating that to them every time a new guest comes.
We are so grateful to CIEE for underwriting this important video that talks about the Justice for Women lecture series and allows us to spread the word beyond these walls. If there is anyone from CIEE, please stand up and be recognized for that underwriting and sponsorship. I want to thank so many of you for coming out this evening to engage in a consequential discussion about seemingly far away assaults on humanity, dignity, and bodily inviolability being experienced by our brothers and sisters in Mexico. Tonight's discussion is not about the all too important domestic policies limiting and in some cases restricting migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border from seeking asylum lawfully. While the topic of human movement at the borders is worthy of significant treatment, the goal this evening is to focus on another fundamental human right, the right to be safe in your body, your person. As is the thematic thread of the Justice for Women lecture series, the goal of our discourse is to provide a second story, a main corollary that runs parallel to our speaker's justice mission to address and seek redress for victims of violence and abuse who have at best been left unprotected by the state. When first introduced to the work of Maria Luisa Aguilar Rodriguez, I immediately drew the connection between the impunity that she is fighting against in Mexico with respect to bodily inviolability and the historic policing of Black communities in America, such policing being a mechanism that reinforces racial inequality. These are complex, systemic threats that assault and diminish our humanity. These threats are exacerbated by our disintegrating systems of education, employment, housing, and healthcare, all leading to a more impoverished society. And this societal poverty will be borne by all of us in one way or another, and in this day or the next. Accordingly, we should act now because, in the words of Nelson Mandela, as long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality exist in our world, none of us can truly rest. How we respond or not will measure our resolve as one people to fight for our collective humanity. My name is Danielle Conway, and I am the proud dean of your University of Maine School of Law. As is our usual custom, I will be asking people to stand. And I ask them to stand because they stand every day for justice. So, let me begin with an extraordinary woman, Chief Justice Lee Softly. A Associate Justice Ellen Gorman, Judge Kermit Lopez, Judge Nancy Torreson, Justice Joyce Wheeler, I see you, Judge William Kayada, up in the rafters. Judge John A. Woodcock, Jr., and we have a tradition of also recognizing foreign-born judges who are here in Maine, so please stand and be recognized. In terms of our legislators, I'd like to recognize Heek Frazi, representing Congresswoman Shelley Pingree. Representative Rachel Talbot Ross. Councilor Jill Dusan. And Councilor Pius Ali. We are a fortunate bunch. So now I will recognize our leadership at the University of Maine system, Chancellor James Page, and the President of University of Southern Maine, Glenn Cummings, who could not be here tonight, but I know that they support our efforts in justice for women. I want to recognize my colleagues. I'll say the name Maggie Fleming over and over and over again. Maggie is my absolute right hand and left hand, and then right foot and left foot. Maggie makes things happen. So Maggie, thank you for putting this together and keeping me straight. But in that vein, I want to recognize the loyal and dedicated staff, faculty, and students of the University of Maine School of Law, as well as the supportive members of the Foundation Board and the Board of Visitors, all of whom make up the Maine law community. So if you are in that community, and you all should be standing, please stand up and be recognized. As many of you are undoubtedly aware, I will conclude my service as Dean of the University of Maine School of Law on June 30th of this year. I am pleased, though, to inform you that the law school will be in the very capable hands of my colleague and my friend, Professor Dimitri Baum, Associate Dean of Academic Affairs. Dimitri is a remarkable human being, and I cannot tell you how many times he has stood beside me to keep me steady and measured, and I am greatly appreciative of that. So now, a greater recognition for our students from high school who are here learning about the topic Justice for Women. I'd like those students to stand from Lincolnville Central School, South Portland High School, Gorham High School, and Camden Hills Regional High School. I want to personally thank all of you for being here. This is very much an extracurricular activity, but I applaud your commitment to learning and to being educated. Finally, I would like to recognize Kathy Lee and the Lee family. The Justice for Women lecture series owes its origin and vitality to Kathy. Through her vision and efforts and the tireless work of the Justice for Women team, Maine has had privileged access to women who are on the front lines of the global struggle for justice. As you saw in the video, the Justice for Women lecture brings phenomenal women from around the globe to Maine. The University of Maine School of Law does something that no other law school in the nation does. It celebrates equality and justice for women and girls. I know for a fact tonight we will be moved by Maria Luisa Aguilar Rodriguez's lecture. She joins a list of phenomenal women, and I look forward to learning from her. Her words will cause us to reflect on our own fundamental questions and concerns about civil rights, human rights, equality, and justice. She will have an important discussion with us, a discussion that needs to be had. We then need to have the courage to hear about the conditions on the ground in Mexico. And then, as hard as it will be, we need to draw the connections to what we are experiencing in the United States and what we are experiencing in Maine. But most important, we need to have this discussion to draw strength from the pertinacity, the dedication, and bravery demonstrated by the actions of Maria Luisa Aguilar Rodriguez. But before we hear from her, we have another tradition. Each year, we honor someone from Maine who exemplifies those words: courage, bravery, dedication, pertinacity. The 2019 recipient of the Justice for Women Courage is Contagious Award is none other than Lucky Hollander. As Lucky comes to the stage, let me begin speaking. I want you to get a nice, good look at her. So walk slowly, Lucky. Slowly. Right here.
We're gonna miss you.
Thank you. Lucky is the founder of Hopeful Links, a project that focuses on making sure unaccompanied minors from war-torn countries have meaningful adults in their lives, safe housing, legal assistance, emotional and medical care, and the support needed to be successful. Lucky has worked in human services for over 45 years, focusing on child and family outreach services and child advocacy. She was inspired to create Hopeful Links after meeting an unaccompanied minor who needed a place to live, and from that meeting quickly realizing the scale of the challenges facing many other children in Portland who had been sent here alone for their safety. Lucky has done extensive training and community organizing locally and nationally on issues of child abuse and prevention, domestic violence, and the use of focus groups to develop programs and community initiatives. She holds a BA in social work and an MS in counseling and psychology. So you see the image of the award that Lucky will open when she gets home. And the beautiful thing about it is it actually rotates.
So you get to say some words.
Sisters! Stop it! Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so here's the deal. The whole back row is my sisters. And they'll clap for anybody up here, so really, seriously. So when Kathy called me, she said I could just say thank you. And I said, okay, I'll just say thank you. And I started thinking about it, and I said, it's not going to happen. And then she said, okay, you have a few minutes. I just want to say, and those of you who know me know what I'm about to say, is that every single person is a courageous, whatever it's called, courageous. I absolutely do nothing that any of you don't do every single day, and some of you a whole lot longer than I, well, maybe not longer, but harder than me. Everybody has their niche, and look around you. Every single person in this room is doing incredible things in their family, in their community, with their children, with their neighbors' children, with somebody around them. And we just can't give awards to everybody. I just want to make sure you understand that there is not a lick of difference between what I'm doing and what a lot of you are doing every single day. Danielle gets a lot of encouragement and a lot of kudos for the law school. But I know the people in the law clinic and how hard they work every single day on every single kid and family that we send them to make sure that they get the best possible representation. There are people in this audience who have done the work with me. There are people in this audience that are in freaking Augusta all the time. There are people in this audience that are doctors and nurses who have volunteered all kinds of time to make sure our kids get the medical care they need. There are people from Maine Health, from Mercy Hospital, who make sure that they get free care without very many barriers at all. Now, part of that is because we've been advocating against barriers, but whatever, they're doing amazing work. And I just want to give you a little bit of a snippet of what we do and how many people help us do it. I could not have possibly settled 60 to 80 unaccompanied minors by myself. We have people who have opened their homes to house them. We've had people who take guardianship of them because if they get a guardian before they're 18, they can file for special juvenile status, which is a much safer way through to a green card than asylum. We have people who can't house but who will mentor kids. We have people who have given them medical care. We have people who pay for their cell phones, people who pay for their eyeglasses, because that's one thing you can hardly get anywhere free, people who pay for their civil surgeon exams so that they can file. There's all kinds of things that people do every single day to make this work. And not just for our program, but for Welcoming a Stranger, who's matched 250 families with mentors in the last 2.5 years. There's an incredible community here. So think about all of the levels of things that you could do and are doing, and then ramp it up a little bit, because we've got lots of families coming. And here's what I want to leave you with. We need to shift the narrative. The narrative in the Wall Street Journal was, we're being invaded by immigrants because of the liberals in Portland and Maine that are welcoming them. We've got to shift that narrative. I have never, ever met anybody who has come here for safety who would rather not be home. They have left their family, they have left their homes, they have left their children in many, many cases. They have never thought that they would ever be here forever. And so instead of focusing as Fox News did today, and the only reason I was watching Fox News is because I was at the Lee Auto Mall, and this is true, I was just telling Adam, and I got stuck with the TV on at Fox, and I was wanting to text him and say, will you come down and change the channel? But what they were talking about was very important to hear. They were talking about an immigrant, a 16-year-old who had, they said, killed somebody. And they expanded, of course, to that to all immigrants. I want to tell you, those same people, when the shooting happened at Sandy Hook, when the shooting happened in a synagogue, when these mass shootings have happened in schools all over the U.S., mostly at the hands of white men, have not ranted and raved on their news. So we need to put in perspective. If you can't donate money so that we can keep helping people without question. There are no rules. When you've been living in human service world all of your life, you finally get to a point where whatever you do in retirement, you do with no rules. I don't do whatever I want to do. I do what I want to do. I don't do anything I don't want to do. And one of the things is we need money so that when something happens, we just get it. If you can't do that, reach out to a kid around you. If you can't do that, mentor somebody. If you can't do that, do whatever you feel like you can in the world that you're living in. But one of the things we can all do is not remain silent. We are in a critical time in our country, and I just want to leave you with not remain silent. When you hear this nonsense that is framing this discussion, speak up and speak loud. And maybe you'll get the award next time. Thank you.
It is now my pleasure to introduce our lecturer, Ms. Maria Luisa Aguilar Rodriguez. Ms. Aguilar Rodriguez is a Mexican human rights advocate. She has spent the last 8 years working to promote accountability for human rights violations at two of Mexico's foremost human rights organizations. She joined the Miguel Agustin Pro Juarez Human Rights Center after working at grassroots organization in the state of Guerrero in southern Mexico, a state notorious for its violence and human rights abuses. At Central Prod, she focuses on access to justice and reparations for victims of human rights violations. She advocates for new judicial mechanisms aimed at combating impunity and works on cases related to women's and indigenous rights, torture, especially sexual torture against women, and enforced disappearances. Ms. Aguilar Rodriguez holds a BA in International Affairs from the Monterey Institute of Technology and Higher Education, and an MA in Human Rights and Theory and Practice from the University of Essex in the United Kingdom. We have a video that will actually precede Ms. Aguilar Rodriguez's remarks. And this video, it's only 6 minutes long, but it's quite potent, quite powerful. It describes one of the enforced disappearance cases that she has been working on, in which 43 students from the rural normal school of Ayotzinapa, were forcibly taken and then disappeared in September 2014 in Iguala, Guerrero, Mexico. So at this time, what I will say is, if you do feel as though you cannot view very tough content, I will ask you to step out and then we'll call you back in. But if you can, I think you should stay and watch.
dijo Abel García Hernández: querido hijo, hoy que no estás conmigo siento un dolor tan grande que no puedo explicar con palabras. Creo que mi corazón cada vez se me hace más pequeño y poco a poco siento cómo se me va desgarrando dentro de mí.
El cielo y el infierno está en este país, ¿no? Un infierno que me refiero por la pobreza, por la violencia, por la corrupción, por la impunidad. En Guerrero se condensa la tragedia de este México violento. Aquí es donde está como sintetizado el drama que vivimos.
Recuerdo cuando partiste lleno de vida y con esa alegría en tu cara. Te fuiste a la escuela normal rural Raúl Isidro Burgos de Ayotzinapa para hacer realidad tu sueño de darnos una vida mejor a nosotros, tus padres.
Pues tengo 2 hijos desaparecidos que iban a la escuela ahí en la normal. El gobierno nada más dice que para acá todo está bien, pero no lo es. Porque hacen falta 43 estudiantes que no sabemos nada de.
En nuestro estado somos alrededor de 3 millones de habitantes. El 70% vivimos en la pobreza. Aquí en la montaña se vive en el infierno de la pobreza. Se vive con los demonios. Que no nos expliquemos por qué tanta violencia, por qué los estudiantes asesinados.
Dicen que estás desaparecido junto con otros compañeros tuyos. Cumplen meses que no sabemos nada de ti y son los mismos días que llevo sin poder dormir y sin comer.
Nosotros vemos las montañas y se ven los árboles muy bonitos. Nosotros estamos en el pie de esos árboles y hemos encontrado muchas fosas clandestinas, muchos familiares. Hay gente que ya lleva muchos años. Mucha gente la hemos encontrado con una venda en los ojos. Gente amarrada de las manos, amarrada de los pies, cráneos con la boca abierta. Nosotros nos imaginamos que los enterraron vivos. Ha habido gente que vive cerca de los cerros y escuchaba gritos de dolor en la noche, gritos pidiendo ayuda. Nosotros no salimos a buscar delincuentes, ya no nos interesa quién lo haya hecho, ya no pedimos justicia. Nosotros queremos recuperar a nuestros familiares que están enterrados.
Los decidimos, el pueblo se decidió a levantarse en armas por lo mismo de tanta delincuencia. No queremos que sigan descuartizando gente los delincuentes.
Y lo único que pedimos al gobierno es que nos deje. Si él no puede tomar el control de la seguridad de nuestra gente, de nuestro estado, de nuestra región, que nos deje hacerlo nosotros.
Yo no puedo creer así. Me echo la culpa por verlo apoyado a mis niños para allá, que se hubieran ido de esa escuela. cosas que dijo ese hombre, que dice que lo quemaron, que lo despedazaron. Diosito me ha ayudado mucho. Pero yo sé que mis niños viven.
Entonces hay una lucha desigual, una lucha sobre todo entre un gigante que es todo el aparato represivo del Estado en contra de la población pobre. Esta guerra se ha venido profundizando más. Sin embargo, esto no quiere decir que nosotros somos rehenes del pesimismo. Estamos ante regiones donde florece la esperanza.
Por último, hijo, quiero decirte que tu pueblo te está buscando. Vivimos con la esperanza de volverte a ver. Tu madre que te quiere, María Micaela Hernández.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you for holding for this video. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Dean Conwell, for opening the doors of your house. When Kathy invited me to be the 2019 Justice for Women speaker, I went right into the Maine website and to see who had spoken in the different years. And you had really some amazing women here, and I'm really humbled and truly grateful for you giving me the opportunity to come here and be the first Justice for Women speaker from the American continent. My name is Maria Luisa Aguilar, but I go by Malu, so it's easier. Anyone can refer to me as Malu. I'm a human rights advocate. I've been working in Mexico in defense of human rights for almost 10 years. I'm a part of the team of Centro Pro, the Human Rights Center Miguel Agustin Pro Juarez, a non-governmental organization based in Mexico City that has been doing this work for almost 30 years. While we are based in Mexico City, we do a lot of work around the whole country. My work focuses more on international and national advocacy strategies in some of the most emblematic human rights violations cases, like the one that you saw, including cases of enforced disappearances, disappearances at hands or with the consent of state agents. By state agents, I mean obviously the armed forces, the police forces, but also anyone who holds power and who knows what is happening around and doesn't do anything. I also work, as Dean was mentioned, in cases of sexual torture against women, especially in cases of detention and arbitrary killings. At Centro Pro, we defend victims of human rights violations and help them in their efforts to access justice. However, as I will tell you in this conversation, in a country where institutions are very weak, litigation before the Mexican court sometimes is not enough. So what we try to do is to approach each case from a comprehensive kind of way, trying to put other strategies that can help the victims to keep voice. So for example, international litigation, political communications strategy, but also capacity building from the same organizations or for other victims. But before I get into details on the situation in Mexico, I wanted to thank Kathy and everyone who was in charge of putting this amazing schedule that I've been having in the last 3 days here at Maine. I had the opportunity to meet with engaged students in Portland High School in the Latinx affinity group, who I hope can send me some pictures about their memory project that they have. I also met with Rich Elementary School, who are working with very young kids to embrace their diversity. I went to South Portland High School, Westbrook Junior High School, and Bates College, where I met many students who wanted to know more about Mexico and what was happening. As you can see, Kathy got me busy these days. I also had the chance to meet very amazing women who have been serving mostly migrants from Central America and Mexico and their families with very scarce resources at the Multicultural Multilingual Center, at Mano a Mano, at the Office of Civil Services. Thanks to Blanca, thanks to Cristal, Cristina, Julia, and Jackie for reminding me that passion has to guide our work every day, and that working case by case makes a difference and makes change and empowers people. I also want to thank Daniela and Stephanie for presenting me their work at Preble Street, Anti-Trafficking Services. It is amazing what a nonprofit can do with the support of their community. And thanks to Julia at Tree Street Youth for allowing me to meet such strong young women there, who in their testimonies show me what empowerment feels like, and how we need many Julias and many Lokis in some part of Mexico to take hard challenges and work within communities. I will do my best to offer you a Mexican perspective on what is happening in Mexico and where I see the opportunities for change. While I focus on my remarks tonight on the work as I do as a human rights advocate, I want you to remember and keep in mind that I describe what we consider to be a human rights crisis, that it's some kind similar of other countries such as Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, from where a lot of migrants come from, and run from their communities and abandon their homes in the search of safety and the opportunity for better lives. Moreover, this is a concept through which those thousands of migrants from Central America have to transit, where they become easy targets of all kinds of abuses and discrimination. Remember that for many of those migrants, the Mexican-US border is only the last challenge that they have to face. They must first transit through the horror of being smuggled in Mexico, being subjected to forced labor, extortion, trafficking, and many other abuses. So I first would like to tell you more about what in Mexico we say that it's a human rights crisis and the causes of it. For the last decade, Mexico has been immersed in increasing violence. The numbers tell us a lot about it, and I will tell you a little bit more of them. Since 2006, when the then president of Mexico, Felipe Calderón, launched the so-called war on drugs or war on crime, based basically on the strategy to put armed forces at combating criminal gangs, Mexico has recorded around 200,000 intentional murders, 250,000 intentional murders. We do not really know in how many of these cases the killings have been happening between the confrontation of the armed forces and the security forces and civilians, because these cases started to be recorded at the beginning of the administration of President Calderón, but when they saw that the numbers were rising, they stopped doing it, and they they don't have any transparency around this data, and you will see this in many other cases. In the same period of time, 12 years, 40,000 people have been disappeared. Not simply gone missing, but taken by someone. Although this is the official number, which is highly contested and believed to be much higher in reality. I'm going to say it again, 40,000 people. The number of disappears are accompanied by many more figures of despairs. There are 26,000 body parts or body remains which remain unidentified in local state forensic offices in different parts of the countries. It gets worse. There are around 1,100 clandestine mass graves that have been acknowledged by federal authorities. So this is only the numbers that the federal authorities recognize. Many of them that have been discovered by relatives of those who disappear, whose determination to find their loved ones has led them to look for them in unmarked graves, like the guy you saw in the video, because they met with no response from the authorities. In terms of immigration policy, Mexico is a country of origin, as you know, but also a country of transit, and most recently, a destination country. In the previous Mexican administration of Peña Nieto, the migration policy was one of containment. One of the main programs that was implemented at the Mexican southern border with Guatemala and Belize was the program Frontera Azul, which was founded by the US during the tenure of President Obama. It was put in place to contain the flows of immigrants to the US who came from Central America, who traveled through Mexico to get to the US. And basically what it meant, it was the militarization of our southern border. The current Trump administration is even more focused on funding Mexican programs to stop Central Americans from ever reaching the US, as you know. Between June 2014 and December 2018, Mexico detained more than 600,000 migrants from Central America and deported more than 570,000 back to their home countries. This obviously does not stop migration. This has all, what it means is that people had to go and to other routes, seeking less accessible routes, leaving them to be more vulnerable and more exposed to violence as they try to cross Mexico. In addition, a larger number of people have been displaced within Mexico. Some estimated that hundreds of thousands of Mexico had to leave their homes, internally displaced, just in the last decade. But the Mexican authorities do not really recognize that there is internal displacement because they will have to have policies to approach these communities, so we don't have official numbers. Unofficial efforts to report the atrocities can be life-threatening. Mexico continues to be one of the most dangerous countries for journalists. According to Article 19, an international non-governmental organization devoted to freedom of expression, since 2000, 124 journalists have been murdered in Mexico in situations related to their work. But I really need to explain a little bit more what I mean with war in Mexico and what the war has been. Like in any war, nothing is black and white. In many places in Mexico, it's really not possible to say who's the good side and who's the bad side or who's the criminal. It's not a war between good state agents and organized crime, because the line between them sometimes is really blurred. Mexican institutions are increasingly weak and fractured, characterized by corruption and the use of unaccountable violence from the state in a context of what we call macrocriminality. By macrocriminality, I mean the penetration of criminal interests into institutions that result in the collusion between financial, political, and territorial power at all levels. So many of these institutions, the institutions that have to support Mexico, have been co-opted by criminal networks. The core of the crisis is based on impunity. What does impunity mean? I mean, the crimes that are committed are often not are committed and nothing is done. They are not investigated. No one is arrested. No one is charged. No one is held accountable. The conditions have existed in Mexico uninterrupted for human rights violations since the 1960s, in the days of the Dirty War. Impunity still reigns today. 98% of the reported crimes in Mexico are never solved. And according to the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, torture is generalized and is usually used as a key means of investigation. But impunity is not only the lack of judicial control. It is also the result of a system that lacks accountability, lacks transparency, and that is characterized by this collusion that I was mentioning. But who are the people behind these numbers? I mean, what are the lives of those who are being affected by violence and human rights violations? Those are the stories that I work with and I advocate for. There are thousands of other victims that, just like them, many of them survivors, whose determination and untiring struggle for justice is the basis of our hope and that change can come to Mexico. As you saw in the video, on September 26, 2014, 43 students from the Normal Rural School Raúl Isidro Burgos of Ayotzinapa in Guerrero State were disappeared by police in Iguala, Guerrero, after they tried to commandeer commercial passenger buses for a political demonstration. That night, 6 people were executed, including 3 students from the same school, and several dozens of people were injured. 2 of them were students. One of them continues to need round-the-clock care because he's in permanent vegetative state, and the other was shot in the face and has required years of intensive medical treatment. For 4 years, The mothers and fathers of 43 students disappeared have been demanding the truth about what happened that night. They are demanding to know the whereabouts of their children. Despite the fact that it's been documented that security forces at different levels, at the local and at the federal level, participated in the attacks and in the detentions, and that some of the elements of the army were present during those events, the previous Mexican federal administration treated this case as a case of local collusion, dismissing the case, saying that it was only a group of municipality police that was working with local criminal gangs. However, the so-called Ayotzinapa case became known across the country and internationally as seen as the representative of the impunity that prevails in Mexico, but also the macrocriminality context that exists in some parts of Mexico. For more than 4 years, the families of Ayotzinapa students had to fight an official version of the events, which was completely unsupported by any scientific evidence. The official version was based, instead of evidence, on numerous irregularities on the investigation, including due process violations and testimonies of detainees obtained by torture. The state institutions were determined to obstruct justice rather than actually giving truth to the victims. These families come from very remote areas where opportunities, including actually accessing to education, are scarce and violence is widespread. These families from day one were treated with disdain by the authorities because they were poor. Ayotzinapa is a teacher training college for rural teachers. So I have heard stories here at Maine of brave women from Central America who came here so they can give a better life to their children, using exactly the same words that I hear every day and many times by the mothers or fathers of Ayotzinapa. Many of them were migrants here in the US, searching for work so they could send some money back to give their children a better life. It is their dignity and their strength and determination that have opened up some possibilities in this case for justice. In December 2018, the now new President López Obrador signed his first presidential decree, which ordered all government institutions to cooperate in the investigation of this case, based on the acknowledgement that truth in this case had not been reached. The decree orders the creation of a commission for truth and access to justice in the Ayotzinapa case. With this decision, the new administration has publicly committed to find truth and the whereabouts of the students. If the new administration succeeds in solving these cases, it will demonstrate Mexicans and the world that Mexico is not condemned to lies and that can change impunity. At Centro Pro, we also work with other cases of disappearances, helping other brave families to organize themselves and access justice. One example is the case of Maria Herrera Trujillo, a mother who is still looking today 4 of her children who disappeared in different parts of Mexico in 2008 and 2010. She and her family are organizing other families that are also searching for the disappeared children to demand a fair and truthful explanation from the authorities in their cases. Maria Herrera and her sons have created a group that is called Enlaces Maria Herrera, made up of families that have been organized brigades to search on their own for their relatives. In this quest, Doña Maria and her organization have done a lot of work to understand and document the main causes of violence in those places where disappearances are widespread. They have found information on the whereabouts of many of those who were disappeared, in some cases even from the own perpetrators, and they have been able to force authorities to search for their relatives in the fields and not only from desks. Much of the crisis can be understood also because of the failed national security model in place over the last decade. The use of the armed forces for regular policing tasks has increased human rights violations, including arbitrary executions, which have risen in the last years. One example of this is the Tlatlaya case, documented and denounced by Centro Pro after a brave survivor came to us and denounced the killing of her daughter. In this case, it was initially explained away by the authorities as a confrontation between the military and the criminals. But with the testimony of the survivor, the work of a brave journalist, and the documentation of Centro Pro, we found that executions at hands of the armed forces had taken place and had been hidden. Centropro proved also that the military units involved in the events had received a written order, and I quote, "Take out the delinquents in the dark hours." An order that we don't know to how many units it's been sent. In this context of increasing human rights violations, torture survivors have been key to helping us understanding the impacts of these government failed security policies. This is the case of a group of 11 women who were sexually tortured in 2006 by security forces in a repressive security operation led by the federal and state police in Atenco in the state of Mexico. The objective of the security operation was to evict flower sellers at the local market, who were part of a larger movement against the construction of an airport in the locality. Centropro represents these brave women in the claims for the national and international level. Recently, the Inter-American Human Rights Court ruled against Mexico and ordered the state to investigate events, including the change of command in the planning of the operation. These survivors, along with other brave women, created a campaign to raise awareness to the use of sexual torture against women in Mexico, especially women in detention. They called the campaign "Breaking the Silence Altogether Against Sexual Torture." The campaign gives voices to survivors and aims to draw attention to the pattern of the use of sexualized torture as a generalized practice in the framework of the security policies taking place, as an extreme expression of institutional gender violence and discrimination. This campaign has also helped us to document and make visible the persistent and documented pattern of the use of torture by the armed forces when they are carrying out policing functions. As I mentioned earlier, President Obrador recently won the 2018 presidential election, campaigning on a platform of bringing change and ending impunity, arguing that all Mexicans were tired and fed up of the corruption. We at Centropro believe that change can happen, and we are supporting work where we believe that things can move forward. For example, the work we do around the newly created Commission of Truth that I mentioned in the case of the 43 students. There is a lot of hope across Mexico that things can change, but the roadmap to solve this complex reality requires strong actions and measures from President Obrador. I want to mention 5 actions where we think at Centropro that it will be key to step to combat impunity. One, and I really like what Loki was saying, is that the narrative has to change. The narrative on impunity also has to change. Key figures in the administration, in the current administration, has recognized that Mexico is in the midst of the human rights crisis. This recognition is a complete change in the narrative about the reality in Mexico and a step forward. The previous administration rejected any suggestion that human rights crisis was happening in Mexico, despite all the figures that I give you. They refused to consider not only our documentation, but also the documentation that UN special rapporteurs and other experts were finding when they were visiting Mexico and were proving that human rights violations were taking place. The current administration has publicly acknowledged the victims of human rights violations in the long-standing failure of government to address the situation. For example, the new administration has publicly apologized to Lidia Cacho, a journalist and survivor of sexual torture that was ordered by a local governor in collusion with a powerful entrepreneur that controlled a sex trafficking network. She denounced it in 2005. So she was subjected to sexual torture for doing her work as a journalist. They have also apologized to 5 families of 5 youth that were disappeared in Tierra Blanca in Veracruz in 2015 by the local police force, and to the families of 2 postgraduate students killed by the army in the university that I actually attended in Monterrey years before. They were arbitrarily killed by the army in 2010 and cover up all their actions. In all of these cases, the families have accepted the apology, but they have also demanded prompt and effective investigations that must lead to justice. Thus, recognizing that Mexico has a human rights crisis is a necessary step, and we acknowledge that, a step forward, but it will only be meaningful if it's followed by actions in specific cases that can address and dismantle impunity. The second action is to approach the causes of violence that need to be changed. The new administration has continually stated that it would put an end to the violence by addressing its causes, creating programs that would tackle the lack of opportunities and poverty in many regions. But the administration has not come to terms with the role of the armed forces in the violence and their responsibility for human rights violations, nor it has shown actually a route where they will build capacities for civilian police forces. The current legislature passed a constitutional reform bill that will create a National Guard, which many of us were afraid that it will perpetrate the militarization of our security. The National Guard bill that has been adopted calls for the armed forces to lead public security strategies for at least 5 more years, which basically means the years that will be López Obrador in his presidency. This happened even though civil society, academics, and international organizations argued forcefully that this will not address the problems with the civilian forces. Civilian controls and over the actions of the armed forces will only be addressed in subsequent laws that should be enacted soon in the near future. An informed discussion on how to strengthen our civilian forces needs to start now and needs to start soon. But most importantly, the current administration must acknowledge that the current model of security has failed, and with the armed forces at the forefront, and is completely obsolete. The third action is that government must address and request international cooperation. Mexico really should openly seek international cooperation in combating and addressing human rights violations. On immigration policies should be addressed at the regional level, with all the actors on the table and without criminalizing those who migrate. But moreover, there are many other ways in which international cooperation can help to fight impunity in cases of human rights violations. Many of the cases of drug pimps or members of the organized crimes that are happening here in the US, some after extraditions from Mexico, can provide valuable information for the victims left behind in Mexico. An example is actually the case of the 43 students from Ayotzinapa. Defendants being tried here in the US for drug trafficking from Iguala to Chicago using passenger buses are believed to have information that will help to solve this case and find the missing students. We know this information already some of this information has been already given by the Justice Department to the Mexican prosecuting authorities, but we know there is more and it has to be obtained soon. In addition, international cooperation could help Mexico enormously with the development and implementation of the emergency forensic plan to identify those tens of thousands body parts that I told you about are still in local forensic units. Mexico does not have the capacity to process these remains and needs to acknowledge it. This should be a priority for the new administration, and Mexico should seek international cooperation directly to be funded for these programs. The fourth action will be the accountability of the past and the new human rights violations. So a key change for the new administration is how to combat impunity. One of the main tasks will be to strengthen institutions, like the new autonomous prosecutor's office. But this is a long-term task. This is something that is going to take us, if we start soon and if we do it right, at least 10 years. So we also need to do monitoring on this, but do other things that can take opportunities in the short and the midterm. Solving the most notorious cases of human rights violations, it's one of them. such as the case of the 43 students of Ayotzinapa, and use these cases as roadmaps to address other similar cases will be a step forward. But most importantly, the key challenge will be for the new administration to hold accountable those who commit violations on its watch. Will the new administration dismiss cases claiming by the victims are criminals, as previous administrations have done it? Or will state perpetrators be held accountable despite inevitable pressure from senior authorities? That's a task that has the President Obrador in upcoming days. 5, the binational relationship must change and must improve. I want to say something about how we see the potentiality in the binational relationships between Mexico and the US and the importance to include human rights in its agenda. In our experience, US policies do directly affect the protection of human rights in Mexico. When there are harsh policies of the US at the border, migrants become more vulnerable and they seek routes into the US that are more risky. When there are fewer restrictions on the sale of assault rifles, there are much more heavy weapons crossing the border into the hands of criminal gangs. With the current approach to increased criminalizing drugs consumers as a response to the heroin and opiate crisis, more trafficking routes are opening and more violence is occurring in Mexico. When cooperation programs from the US grant funds to the armed forces, instead of funding programs that support the rule of law and the requirements of human rights, more abuses are committed in Mexico. All these factors should be part of the discussion around the relationship between Mexico and the US. We are subjected, as you do, to authorities promoting misinformation about these issues. If we can put an end to this on both sides of the borders, we can begin to find solutions that are informed to this crisis. Finally, I really want to thank Dean Conwell for opening the doors to your house at Maine Law School. To many women that, like me, have a lot of things to share with your community. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Malu. In the past 3 days, Malu has been in conversation with well over 1,000 people in Maine, mostly students from elementary school all the way up through law school, in 15 different sessions in 4 cities. And that's not counting her presentation to all of you this evening. And she still has 2 days to go. She has answered every imaginable question, from what motivates her, how does she stay hopeful, how does she keep doing this work, what's her favorite food, what's her favorite sport, how much money does she make. All of which she's answered with information and grace, but my favorite was the last question from the 7th grade this morning at Westbrook Middle School. 7th grader said, "Malu, do you have any regrets?" And she stopped for a second and collected herself and said her only regret was that she didn't become an activist earlier in her life at his age. And then as we left the auditorium, she turned to me and she said, "It's 8:15 in the morning. That's a question you answer over a glass of wine." So now it's your turn to ask questions, and we have about 15 minutes. We're going to sit here and fire away. We have mics. Are there going to be mics? Do we have a microphone for the questions? I see. One over here, and then there's one up in the balcony. So if anybody has a question,
feel free to step up to the mic. Yeah.
Hola, soy Laura Solis. I'm Laura Solis. I actually have been in Maine for over 20 years, and I am from Mexico, from Colima, Mexico, which is right above Guerrero. And I came to the US in the 1990s, early 1990s. And back then, Colima was, well, people would say, a beautiful place. A small state, clean, safe, everybody wanted to be there. And the last 10, 15 years, the whole area has changed. There's a lot of violence. The place has changed completely. Just like you were saying, there are many people who have disappeared. I check the news from time to time, and last time I counted, at least they report that about 900 people disappear or so a year, and they just don't know what happened to them, or they just find bodies. Anyway, and the thing that really annoys me is that people don't comment. You know, it's not like here, you don't have like this freedom to speak. You go and you read the news and they're there, but no one makes any comments. So every so often I go and say, okay, so what can you tell me about? What is the government doing about it? And then no one replies. So anyway, and then there's nobody who follows my comment. So anyway, I guess what I wanted to say is that people are not free to speak there. They're afraid to talk. And journalists, it's not only been in the last 10 years, but since I was a kid, journalists who were especially speaking against the government and the policies or were criticizing the government in some way would just disappear. So I guess things just have gotten worse. So lastly, I was there back in November, and I'm going back in 2 weeks just to visit family. And people say that where I'm from, Colima is at the level of Somalia when it comes to being a very unsafe place to be, along with Guerrero and other places in Mexico. So they say not to go at night, to just hang out with friends, but just not to go and expose yourself. So I don't really know what the roots of that is, but at least for what people are telling me, where I'm from is that it all has to do with the drugs. I don't know if that's all true, but at least where I am from, they say that there are many cartels trying to take control of that territory. Anyway, I don't know if that is true or not, but certainly people that I knew and I grew up with are no longer with us. So.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on anything she said, Malu, about the question of whether it's really gangs that are responsible for the violence?
First, I'm sorry for your loss because that's what happened in Mexico. Many families have been touched.
Mike?
Is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah? No, I mean, those are the stories. Families are touched by violence. I don't think, I mean, it is related to drugs, the violence, but the problem is that the criminality has spread in so many sectors that I'm not an expert on how, like on numbers exactly on how many, how much of the economy depends on, of the criminal economy depends only on drugs. But what I want to say is just that it is the lack of response of those authorities and the weakness of those institutions that allow us to be that afraid of what you are saying. And yeah, and people is afraid in Mexico.
It's corruption
Yeah.
at the highest level.
Yeah.
Yes.
I want to thank you for being here. You talk a lot about failed policies and about failed government, and especially with U.S. policy. Are there any examples that you could give of, in the past, of policies or actions, either Mexican government or U.S. government, that actually promoted justice and a lack of impunity?
Well, the U.S. has been a strong supporter of the change on the judicial system. We had a change in the way that the criminal process were being proceeded. We had an inquisitorial system before 2008, and now we have a normal system after that. And I think, obviously, it's not, it hasn't changed the main structure. Oh, sorry. But what I want to say about that is that cooperation serves for some things, and there are programs that can be enhanced. And things can move forward if they are being watched over, and if really the other part of the cooperation is interested in continue to follow up on what is happening, because in that case, a lot of money was put on the changes in the judicial system in Mexico, and really it hasn't done its job for that. I think she's...
Go ahead.
My name is I'm an anthropologist, and I've actually been living between here and Guerrero, Mexico, and working at the state university there, the Universidad Autónoma de Guerrero. So first, I really commend the work you're doing and your bravery in doing it. I think there are really very few people there who do stand up for human rights and do the kind of work you're doing. It's extremely difficult. I think, as the previous commentator said, people don't really speak up, and the system is in place where you kind of replicate the same things and don't really take a stand. But I'm curious to know, at the end you talked about the hope of change, and especially with the new president, who really does seem to have a break with the previous governments, even with other parties that have been in power since 2000. There's an alternation of parties, but not really one who represents a more leftist, just a very different kind of ideology and set of policies that they're proposing. So I'm curious to know how likely you think things really could change. I mean, you've mentioned some concrete steps, but I'm wondering, how likely do you think it is that those steps might be put in place, or other kinds of policies? Because sometimes it's hard to feel optimistic just given the political culture in Mexico and how really deeply rooted these problems are. You know, as you said, the force of the organized crime groups, the collusion with government forces, that kind of blurry line between them. So I'm curious to know whether you think things really can change and what more it will take for that to happen.
No, as I mentioned, I think there are opportunities. I'm not sure if they are going to take all the opportunities that they're facing. But what I have to say is that we and when I mean we, it's like civil society, people who work with persons that are looking for justice, really have to take the chance to work with somebody that is saying that they want to make a change. It will be very irresponsible from our side if we don't take that step. Because at least, for example, in the case of Ayotzinapa, for the last 4 years, those families have been resisting. I mean, they haven't gone, they do one step forward and they do 2 setbacks. So yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Some days they say very good messages. Some days they present bills like the ones on the National Guard, and that tells us that they are not going to change the security model. But in terms of what we do in the daily life with families, it's our job, really.
Jackie? Hello, I have a comment and a question, but I'm gonna begin with my comment. I just want to illuminate something upon you all, if you haven't been already, what she has said. there's a ton of violence in South and Central America, and a lot of us come here to basically start a new life, but we're still faced with discrimination, with racism. So I just want to point that out, that we do come here, we face a bunch of problems back home, and we come here and face more. So I just want to just put it out there, so you guys have that in mind too. Also, my comment is that what inspired you to become an activist?
Well, I mean, I think I knew that, or I used to work a lot on human rights issues, but to be an advocate, to be an activist, and what that really means, I think it was the work of many people who I work with in Guerrero, who I work with in the communities, and their strength and their determination. And when you learn from good teachers, you go forward.
Over here? Let's go up here, and then over here to the left, and then we'll go back to you. Okay, yes.
Hi, and I wanted to thank you so much for being with us tonight and for sharing your journey and bringing that light to us all. So I have the privilege to be here tonight as an admitted student to Maine law. I'm originally from Southern Appalachia, in the foothills, so I couldn't help but feel like there were some correlations between the region as it was portrayed in the video and the place that I'm familiar with, just in terms of its struggle and the entrenchment with long-term and generational poverty. And my experience professionally so far has been that of working with survivors and their families of either childhood sexual abuse or sexual assault. And my perception was always that whenever there was a commitment to a lack of truth by a larger entity, by a local government or a broader level of government, that there was a special anger for those families and in that process. And so I was hoping that you might be able to talk to the experiences of those surviving families and how your organization tries to serve as a support in their experience.
Yeah, well, yeah, totally. I mean, like survivors and victims of human rights violations passes through different moments of grief, different moments of pain. What we do, we actually don't have in-service psychosocial services, but we work with a network of people who are experts on psychosocial perspective. We try to, in each case-by-case, assess what the victims need. In some cases, when there are like large groups of victims, like in the cases of the disappearances, what we try to do is to create first an assessment. This is something that we just created, for example, for this case. We did first an assessment with a group of experts, not only psychologists, but other anthropologists and other people who have been or have knowledge of how to treat victims. And they did a whole assessment on the impacts, on the psychosocial impacts of the families of the students that were disappeared, but also on the survivors, on the community in Iguala, and even in some, with some other collectivities of victims that continuously say that the disappearances of the 43 were felt like the disappearance of their children once again because of all the attention that happened around. So yeah, we try to get a lot of help from other people who knows how to deal with pain and with those impacts.
We've been hearing stories over the last 3 days about how important the voices of these families have been in getting any kind of attention to the case, and her organization supports them. So the disappearances happened on the 26th of the month in 2014, every month these families come to her office in Mexico City. They have a dormitory there where they stay, and they demonstrate on the 26th. And so keeping alive in people's minds that this is happening. And so their work with the families has been absolutely crucial to anybody even finding out that this has been happening. Over here?
Hi. I hope you can hear me. So I know you talked about how the U.S. government can work on our regulation of our guns and our immigration policy, but I was wondering if you saw any other way that the U.S. government could play like a positive role in this issue, because like I know that there's been like a history of U.S. intervention in Latin America that's been super negative, and so I was just curious if you saw any more direct way that I guess the government or the people, I guess, of the United States can help out in ways, and yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that always talking about cooperation in relations between Mexico and the U.S. and Latin American countries, it can raise controversies. But really, for many years, we have always turned back to a lot of allies here in the U.S. We have really good allies in non-governmental organizations that do a lot of good work on how to push the U.S. government to change policies here that impact directly in our countries. We have allies in the Congress, like congressmen and congresswomen who have sent a lot of letters to the U.S. Department to say you need to continue to put some attention in those cases. We have allies in many unions here that also, like, for example, teachers' unions that knew what was happening with this case and wanted to know more about it because they were part of a larger organization of teachers' unions in the world and wanted to do something. So I think it's always about how to look, how to reach out and how to also ask what is needed. I mean, we always have a lot of ideas of how you can help.
We're going to take one more question.
Ok, María, mi pregunta es, bueno, yo creo que aquí el tema que me he identificado, me he enfocado, que soy madre de familia, y me pongo a pensar en estas 44 personas que perdieron a sus hijos y que están pasando un trauma psicológicamente y de ver frustrados los sueños de estos adolescentes, porque sabemos que entre ellos fueron personas, niños que quisieron llegar a ser astronautas, quisieron llegar a ser abogados, quisieron llegar a ser médicos, y sus sueños fueron truncados por personas inconscientes. Yo quisiera saber qué forma tu organización psicológicamente ayuda a estas personas, porque me pongo a pensar, digo yo, bueno, tengo un hijo que quiere ser defensor de los derechos humanos, pero si ahorita en este momento le truncaran la vida, yo pienso que mi vida se vendría abajo. Yo quisiera saber cómo ustedes pueden lidiar con esas personas para por lo menos calmar ese dolor.
Blanca, are you going to translate for us?
I'll try to do that.
Sorry.
Let's see. I come here like a mother, you know, with children. And just to think about the 43 children that were missing from their parents, I think about the psychological trauma that must have caused to see the loss of dreams and of future that never happened, that they could have been doctors, lawyers, they wanted a better life. And I think about, you know, my own son, that he wants to be an activist, you know, but I worry about the families and how they are going to get through this, because if you are doing, and I'm maybe adding something here, so I'm sorry. if you're doing something if you're not taking care of the psychological trauma, then how are these families really going to heal? Because that's a lot to carry. And what I just, me, the interpreter, what I did hear you say earlier was that there was some psychosocial evaluations that happened, but I just wondered whether this question also relates to that.
Yeah, when I mean psychosocial, I mean that usually what we have is people who understands that this trauma and this pain is not something that can be approached only with therapy, because the impacts are never just a direct. Yeah, it's something that you cannot just process in that way. It has an impact on the community, on the families. That it has to also be understood as a political process, because if not, the first thing that a mother says, and she said in the video, is that I help them to get into the school. And if that sentence is not processed through also kind of a political process, I'm sorry, I'm saying process a lot, but if that is not converted also or seen as a political issue, that it is that no, there were state agents that were doing this, that were supposed to first take care of your children in school, but also at that moment, then things are just do not move forward, or just stay as a trauma that can be solved within the family. And when we talk about psychosocial approach, we talk about this, like that it's something bigger than just the individuals. And because we also don't have a lot of resources, and that's something that it's always happens in this kind of cases. What we try to do is try to reach out of a lot of experts from outside that can help us to do this at the group level. So if somebody needs individual attention, then we try to access it for them. But if not, we try to do it at the group level as the collective, with the collective.
One of the really interesting things that keeps coming up again and again in her explanations and answers to the school kids is how important it is to have strong institutions. I mean, there basically is no rule of law there, because the criminals and the authorities are so intertwined, you can't tell the difference. And so it's a reminder to me how important it is for us to continue to pay attention to the strength of our institutions, because this is what happens when you don't have the rule of law and strong institutions. So I'm going to ask you now to join me in thanking Malu, and then I'm just going to make a few closing remarks. I also want to thank Maggie, who has done an amazing job, and Blanca, who you've seen, who has helped us from the beginning of this process, and all of the women who were on the panel that we did on Monday on the Latinx community in Maine and what their experiences are, to Julia Sleeper from Tree Street and Eclas, for CIEE for that wonderful video, and all the partners that have supported us who are in the brochure, which you can pick up on your way out if you're interested. For those of you who come to the lecture every year, you know the drill. This is when I stand up and say, we still haven't fully funded the endowment. We still need your contributions to make this program permanent, and it's all still true. So I'm not going to repeat it all again, because I want to say two other things tonight. I want to call your attention to two treasures that we have in this community. that are underappreciated. The first is the law school that brings you this program every year, and so much more. There are 4 clinics that offer students the opportunity to be hands-on lawyers. They can represent real clients in real cases. Maine Law, through its Refugee and Human Rights Clinic, is the only law school in the country that creates an opportunity for law students to go to the border, to Laredo, Texas, and participate in intake interviews and the evaluation of asylum claims. That's an incredible experience, and to hear the students talk about how that opened their eyes is really something you don't forget. The students get an amazing taste of what it means to be a public interest lawyer. There are other clinics that also help the community. They help lots of low-income people access justice who otherwise wouldn't have that opportunity. The law school has a Center for Oceans and Coastal Law and a Center for Law and Innovation, all of which contribute to research and public policy. There's a rural lawyer project, which is helping to develop the next generation of rural lawyers that we so desperately need. And I want to just tell you directly that we don't support this law school the way we need to. We don't, the state doesn't, the university doesn't, and if we don't do that, we're not going to have this rich institution that we all just assume is always going to be there and always going to be doing amazing things. It won't without our support. So I ask you to keep that in mind whenever you hear anything about the law school. The second treasure is one that is near and dear to my heart, and that is Danielle Conway, who is she's moving on to become the dean of the law school at Penn State in June. Her departure is a huge loss for Maine law, for the Portland community, for the whole state of Maine, for me personally. Danielle is a force. She's been an inspiration, a mentor, a friend to me, and certainly a friend to Justice for Women. And if ever there was a courageous woman, here she is. So I want to ask Danielle to come up here because we're going to honor her tonight also with her own Courage is Contagious award that she can take away. So thank you, and we'll see you next year.